Hello, Richard the Dick Coughlin 616. How are you? Whatever subject you're discussing on the internet, you're always going to bring along at some point a huge cross-section of extremist Looney Tunes who feel they want to chime in and give their 2 cents. There is absolutely no topic that is devoid of its hardcore hoarders of premium batshit. But some subjects have a lot more than most, and in my opinion, the subject that comes across with the most amount of fundy fucktards is Israel versus Palestine. I hate talking about this subject because it's almost impossible to have a conversation for more than 2 minutes before you're interrupted by some hateful bellend. Racists, anti-Semites, nationalists, xenophobes, Islamophobes, the far right, the far left, fundamentalist Muslims, ultra-Zionists, fascists, fearmongers from all sides can all be found in various quantities and various degrees when it comes to Israel/Palestine. Now, for me, there are generally 3 positions that people tend to fall into. It's not as simplistic as this, but it generally tends to be one of these 3. Number 1, people who realise the sensitivity and complexity of this issue and realise that we're only going to resolve it if we set realistic goals and are fair to all sides. 2, those who hate Israel and everything it ever says, does or did or will do for any number of insane, misguided or naive reasons. And 3, those who love Israel so much you get the impression they would really like to go there, dig a hole in the ground, take their penis out and mate with it. In my experience, it's one of these 3 positions or categories that people will fall into. I want to be as reasonable as I can, but I realise no matter how balanced and fair I am to anyone, I know at the end of the day the people who hate Israel are just going to hear the points where I defend it and then turn around and say, Jew. And those who love Israel will only ever hear the criticism of it and go, you Nazi fucking disgusting, horrid Muslim anti-Jew. And to those people, I would just like to say, fuck off. Fuck off now. I have no desire of trying to humour, or even attempting to try and humour, the fact that your opinion is relevant to me. To the rest of us, let's continue. Now, Israeli supporters may feel the urge to immediately sit there now and type away one of 2 default arguments that I always hear, which is 1, Israel has the right to defend itself, and 2, Israel has the right to exist. Well, before you waste any of your fucking time trying to type those out, I'd just like to say, I agree with you. Yeah, you're right. I ain't got a problem with that. Yeah, I agree. Yes, it has the right to exist, and it has the right to defend itself. Now, in all fairness, I very rarely in my time have come across anybody who actually believes the opposite of that. It seems to be no matter who criticises Israel, no matter what you say, it's always Israel has the right to defend itself, as if that was the argument. I don't hear the argument. I'm sure there are 1 or 2 fucking Fruit Loops out there who like to argue that, you know, Israel has no right to exist. But their opinion is really relevant, and it's certainly a minority view, and it's not worth trying to make that a default argument. So don't waste your fucking breath, okay? The only argument that I really can't stand that people use to try and justify Israel and what it does is the old holy land, our ancestors lived here, we blah 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 blah. It's a ridiculous argument. I find it even more laughable when I hear atheists making this argument. Like, their ancestors came from there, they have the right to go back there. That means that any place that I used to live, technically, I have the right to go there, regardless of who's there now, and just say, I used to live here. I used to live here, not my ancestors, fuck them, me. Technically, we all descend from Africa, so we can all fuck off there, can we? Our ancestors all came from everywhere, if we worked it out far enough. You know, if we went back far enough, we could walk around anywhere and say, we own this. Well, so anyone who wants to make that argument, all I have to say to you is, cool story, bro. Bottom line is this. Israel is invading and occupying, and has been for 40 years, land that doesn't belong to them. They are evicting people from their homes and building settlements, many of which are only for Jews. For their own people. That's it. And they've built this big fucking security wall that goes all the way around, that has destroyed many Palestinian communities, because Israelis can go back and forth, and the Palestinians can't. It takes them fucking hours to get through. And it's been declared illegal by the UN. That is all that matters as far as I'm concerned. Now, this is where it gets complicated. You see, people have fallen into the trap with this discussion of picking one side that they support and opposing the other side with more vehemence than they support the side that they support. To the point where the people they are opposing, or the side that they are opposing, has now become dehumanised. Do I hold all Israelis accountable for the occupation? No, of course I fucking don't. Do I think Israelis hate all Palestinians and want them to be wiped out? No, I don't. In fact, there are many activist groups within Israel that protest the government, what it does, and protest the wall and the occupation. The same way there were a million people walking in the streets many, many years ago opposing the invasion of Iraq. A government's actions are not reflecting of the people, okay? And we need to stop treating it that way. Likewise, I do not prescribe everything Hamas do to the Palestinians. I'm sure there are many people who agree with the actions of Hamas, but that doesn't mean we can treat each Palestinian that way. I know and understand perfectly well that anti-Semitism, in the context of just hatred of the Jews, in its traditional sense, is very real and rife throughout a lot of the Arab world, not just Palestine. Now, do the actions of Israel justify this? Not really. Does it exist just because of Islam? Maybe, for some people, yes it does. But for others you'll find that most people, even people who have bigoted views towards the same group, generally have a variety of reasons for feeling that way. Yes, I know there are quotes in the Quran that you're going to pull out and go, oh, this is about the Jews, this is about the Jews. I don't care. Yeah? I can pull out quotes from the Bible that say that Christians are supposed to do this, and Christians are supposed to do this, and Christians are supposed to think this, and Christians are supposed to say this. But they don't, do they? A lot of them don't. As much as we might want to make the motivations and the sort of reasons behind this conflict as simple as possible, the fact is, to do so is actually making it worse. It's detrimental to the issue. This is not black and white. It's not good and evil. Which brings me onto Pat Condell. In recent months, Pat's videos have been less about religion and atheism and more sort of politically and ideologically driven. And this has motivated him to make several videos, I think it's at least 3 or 4 in the last year, expressing his undying support and total and utter commitment to Israel. He's even made statements, and people always go on about this, oh, Pat Condell's not racist, he only talks about Islam. Well, Pat Condell, in his video, The Great Palestinian Lie, actually stated, and I quote, I used to think that Arabs could handle democracy. So in the eyes of Pat Condell, if you're an Arab, you can't handle democracy. Yeah, that's not racist, is it? It is rather funny that a guy who complained so much about immigrants invading and taking over and trying to impose their way of life would have support for Israel, and to the point where he absolutely cannot see or even acknowledge the fact that Israel does anything of that sort to the Palestinians. This is likely due to the fact that, as I've just said, Pat denies that Palestine properly exists, but even if he did acknowledge that it did or didn't exist, and even if it actually didn't exist in that way, I fail to see how this is justification for destroying people's homes. Right? How is that okie dokie with anyone? That land must belong to fucking someone. I doubt if an invading foreign army came to his house and knocked it down that he would accept that as any sort of justification. Pat also links and uses anti-Semitic statements made by Hamas about Jews and Israelis, which, by the way, I find disgusting and despicable, just want to make that clear. But what this has to do with anything, I don't really know. I'm less concerned about the crazy statements made by a group of nutters than I am about how likely it is that those groups of nutters can pull off any of those crazy statements. I don't want to have to pull out the death tolls of Israelis and Palestinians over the years. I'm sure we'll see that Israel has been kicking their ass. When Anjem Choudary comes to the UK and says one day an Islamic flag will fly over 10 Downing Street, the only thing I find shocking about that statement is that there are actually people out there who take him seriously, who think that this guy's actually got a chance of making this happen. It's quite obvious to me that the Israeli army, military, and the allies of Israel are quite capable of squashing the ever-loving shit out of Hamas, like that if they wish. However, it's not undeniable that Hamas do intend to cause harm, and have done to an extent, and I understand why there is that need or desire to build that wall, because let's face it, these suicide bombings have been reduced to 0 since it's been put up. But does this justify the occupation? No, it doesn't. Plus, if you're gonna use quotes from Hamas against Palestine, then why not do the same with Israel? Why not take quotes that people in charge of Israel have elected leaders in charge of Israel have made, and use that against Israelis. For example, former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon said, "I vow that if I was just an Israeli civilian and I met a Palestinian, I would burn him and I would make him suffer before killing him." Now, is it okay for me to take that quote in order to legitimise any and all attacks that Hamas make against Israel? No? Then stop doing it the other way round then. I don't think that if the occupation vanished that suddenly it would all be wonderful flowers of marshmallows and rivers of chocolate through there. No, it wouldn't be that at all. But Pat Condell seems to want to sweep under the carpet every act committed by Israel that is wrong and create this into a good and evil situation. That nothing Israel ever done or has done has exacerbated tensions or made things worse. As if everyone in Israel has said, they're going, hey, what are we doing? We're just sat here, we're just minding our own business, we've got Pushkin and his Svechkin, I was sitting here, I don't mind the Babel, we're calling my phones, we've got my little hair on, and I'm sitting here, because I imagine everyone who lives in Israel talks like Jackie Mason. But you know, for a guy who hates religion so much, I find it funny that Pat Condell manages to turn almost every problem into the world into the issue of good versus evil, which is as religious a way of thinking as you can possibly get. And then also, amazingly, isn't it incredible that Pat always seems to be on the side of the good guys? He's never wrong about that, is he? Now, there's nothing more religious than that, is there? I realise this might have gone on for a little while, but I'd like to give you an opinion. I'd like to read from you a book, and I'm going to read some quotes here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it sums up a much more, I think, fair and reasonable way of looking at Israel and Palestine. I had always assumed that the Christians were really in charge because they control America, and America controls Israel. We know, for example, that not all Zionists are Jews. There are a number of influential Christian Zionists who would like nothing better than for the Jews to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, because they believe that this will herald the second coming of Christ, and as added bonus, the final destruction of those pesky Christ-killing Jews. That's right, the ones who won't convert. Apparently Christ is going to come and show Hitler and the Catholic Church how it should have been done. Meanwhile, the political situation in Israel is like a knotted rope. The harder you try and pull it, the tighter it gets. And this is because both sides remain vigilant against any possible outbreak of peace. Islamists on one hand, and settlement-building Jews on the other. In other words, the people most strongly motivated by their religious beliefs. What a surprise. We know Israel has nuclear weapons, and we're pretty sure it would use them if its existence was seriously threatened. So I think we can all safely assume that Israel is not going to disappear anytime soon without a nuclear war, which would be a disaster for the Middle East. It would